All right, let's get into it, shall we? Today's topic, well, it might seem like a history lesson, but stick with us because it really has a huge impact even today. We're going to be diving into the war on drugs.
Yeah. And, it's really a complicated thing. I mean, they were trying to, curb drug use, right?
Right.
But the consequences were, well, seriously profound and often not at all what they intended, especially for black communities.
Absolutely, and that's why we're doing this deep dive, right? We want to get beyond just the surface, past just listing events, and really unpack how this policy, even though it rarely directly talked about race, really had this lasting impact on Black Americans for, generations.
Totally.
Our main source for this exploration is a crash course video on Black American history, and it really got us thinking.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
They don't avoid the tough stuff,
No.
and we're going to follow their lead. So, yeah, get ready because we're going deep.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. Before we get to the official start of the war on drugs, back in the 1960s, there was a shift in, the political landscape that we really need to understand.
Right, because even though you had President Lyndon B. Johnson pushing for civil rights and social programs, he also, launched this war on crime. It feels a little, contradictory.
It does, yeah. And that's where the complexity comes in. Like this war on crime, it led to policies like the Law Enforcement Assistance Act and the Safe Streets Act.
Right.
And these acts kind of funneled resources to law enforcement. And, it wasn't their intention, but this led to more surveillance and the militarization of the police. And this was especially true in low-income urban areas, which were, mostly black.
And then there's the Moynihan Report. It did acknowledge how racism contributed to Black poverty, but it also put this controversial focus on Black family structures. It kind of feels like blaming the victims, doesn't it?
It does. It really shows how research that seems neutral can, reinforce biases that are already there.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of sets the stage for policies that disproportionately impact communities that are already marginalized.
Mm.
But it's important to note that there was pushback against these things. The Black Panther Party saw the over-policing happening.
Right.
So they organized these community patrols, right, to try to protect their neighborhoods from, police brutality.
Yeah, that's powerful.
And they also created programs, things like free breakfast for children and community schools, try to address the lack of resources in these areas.
It's a good reminder that even in these really complex historical events, there's always agency.
Mhm.
There's resilience, there's the fight for justice.
For sure.
But getting back to the war on drugs, it was President Nixon who really brought it to the forefront, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Hmm.
In 1971, Nixon declared that drug abuse was public enemy number one. He established the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA, and really ramped up the federal government's role in drug control.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the most impactful decisions they made during this time was to categorize marijuana as a Schedule I drug.
Okay.
And that's the most restrictive category, and it set the stage for all the harsh policies that came later.
And then the 80s came around, Reagan was in charge, and things, well, they escalated, right? I mean, just say no was everywhere.
Yeah, it was. But behind that catchy slogan, there was a whole wave of policies that really solidified the war on drugs and, unfortunately, just made racial disparities even worse.
Like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, it brought in these mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines that, well, they really hit Black and Latino communities hard. And that difference in sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine, it was just staggering.
5 grams of crack cocaine that carried the same sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. 100-fold difference.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just some, random thing. It reflected the racial biases that were already there, and it led to the mass incarceration of Black Americans.
It's heartbreaking,
Yeah.
to think that policies that were supposed to be about fighting drug use
Yeah.
ended up, just decimating communities and tearing families apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we really need to think about all this in the broader context of what was happening, with the economy and society back then. You had deindustrialization, white flight,
Right.
the rise of that welfare queen stereotype.
Yeah.
Which, that was a narrative that really demonized Black mothers, and it fueled support for, harsher welfare
Yeah.
policies.
Yeah.
So all of these factors, they kind of created this perfect storm that ended up criminalizing Black communities, more than others.
Yeah. It's like this domino effect. One thing leads to another, and it's always those who are the most vulnerable who pay the price. But this whole tough on crime thing, it didn't stop with Reagan, did it? I mean, Clinton's policies, even though they seemed different on the surface, they kind of just made that carceral state even stronger. And that had a devastating impact on communities of color.
Yeah, you're right. So Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control Act. Now, it did have some good things about it,
Hmm.
but it also poured billions of dollars into building more prisons and expanding police forces. It expanded the federal death penalty, and it kind of encouraged states to adopt harsher sentencing laws.
And then there's that three strikes provision.
Right.
Commit three felonies and you're in for a life sentence,
Yeah.
even if those offenses were, pretty minor.
Exactly. And all of this led to this huge increase in the number of people getting locked up, especially for, nonviolent drug offenses.
Mm.
Like the number of people in prison for those offenses, it went from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. That's that's an insane increase. And, well, you know who was disproportionately represented in those numbers.
Yeah, sadly, I think we both know the answer to that. But, I remember hearing people say that Black communities actually wanted those stricter policies. Did our source talk about that at all?
Yeah, it did. And it makes the point that even though there were some calls for stricter law enforcement in Black communities, those calls usually came along with demands for more social programs, like better economic opportunities and an end to police brutality.
Oh,
It
right.
wasn't just about being tough on crime.
Yeah.
It was about safety, but also about justice.
So it was a more nuanced view then, not just pro or anti-harsh punishments. It was about addressing the real issues, the systemic inequalities that were affecting these communities. But even with all those calls for social programs and police reform, the focus stayed on punishment. And the result?
Well, we have this massive carceral state today. For those who might not know that term, can you explain what the carceral state is and, how it connects to the war on drugs?
Sure. So the carceral state basically refers to a society that leans really heavily on policing, surveillance, and imprisonment to solve its problems. And the war on drugs, with its focus on locking people up instead of rehabilitation, really played a big part in expanding this system. It led to too much policing in certain communities, mass incarceration of mostly Black and brown people, and it created the cycle of poverty and marginalization. You get stuck.
Yeah, it's a system that kind of feeds itself. It's not just about individual choices or behaviors. It's about like these systemic forces that keep people trapped. Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look deeper, to go beyond like those simple explanations and really wrestle with how complex these issues are.
That's a good point. But let's be real. Did the war on drugs even work? Did it actually reduce drug use like it was supposed to?
Most experts agree that it was a complete failure. After decades of really harsh policies, billions of dollars spent, and countless lives disrupted, drug use rates basically stayed the same. What we ended up with was a way too big prison system, broken communities, and this legacy of racial injustice that we're still dealing with.
It's really disheartening. All that suffering, families torn apart, and for what? Makes you wonder if it was really ever about stopping drug use, or if maybe it served some other purpose, Something maybe even a little sinister.
That's a question worth thinking about. And it brings us to another really important point, the legacy of the war on drugs. And, its impact goes way beyond just like arrest rates and prison numbers.
So what are some of the lasting effects we're still dealing with today? What does this legacy look like in people's lives?
Well, for one thing, mass incarceration has created a whole generation of kids who've grown up without their fathers or mothers.
Right.
And that leaves a huge hole in families and communities. It's also led to a cycle of poverty and instability. I mean, if you have a criminal record, it's really hard to get a job, find a place to live, or get an education. And then there's the psychological trauma. People lose trust in law enforcement, and it just keeps those harmful stereotypes alive.
It's like this ripple effect. It keeps spreading outward, impacting not just individuals, but whole communities, generation after generation. And it hits Black and brown folks the hardest. I mean, our source pointed out some shocking statistics. Even though Black Americans were only like 12% of illegal drug users, they made up a whopping 41% of those arrested for cocaine and heroin charges.
Yeah, and that's just one example of the huge racial disparity that's all over the criminal justice system. Studies show that even though drug use rates are similar across racial groups, Black people are way more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and given harsher sentences than white people. And it's not just drug offenses either. This disparity is everywhere in the system.
Man, that's a bleak picture. But I think we got to face these hard truths if we want any chance of fixing things.
I agree. We have to go deeper than just the headlines and what politicians say. We have to challenge our own assumptions and listen to the people who have actually lived through these policies.
It's about seeing people as people, not just numbers or stereotypes. Seeing their humanity, their struggles, their resilience.
And recognizing that the legacy of the war on drugs isn't just some history lesson. It's real life for millions of Americans, and it deserves our attention, our empathy, and our action.
Man, it's a lot to process, right? It's heavy stuff. But knowing all this damage, where do we even begin to address it? How do we move forward when the system seems so flawed?
Well, I think it starts with a really fundamental shift, like a change in how we view the problem. We have to move away from just punishing people and start prioritizing public health and harm reduction and rehabilitation. Instead of asking, like, how do we punish?
Yeah,
We should be asking, how do we help?
that makes sense. So what would that look like practically? What are some real things we can do?
Well, I think a good place to start would be decriminalizing or even legalizing some drugs.
Okay.
That would let us take the resources we're using for law enforcement
Yeah.
and put them toward treatment programs and prevention. And we really have to invest in those communities that have been hit the hardest by the war on drugs. Give them economic opportunities, job training, affordable housing, access to good health care, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And education, right? That's got to be a big part of it too. Helping people understand how complex addiction is and, getting rid of all those harmful stereotypes about drug use.
Absolutely. We have to stop thinking of addiction as some kind of moral failing. It's a public health issue, that's all. And that means we need to have these, open and honest conversations. We need better drug education in schools. And, even police officers need training to, like, better understand and respond to substance use disorders.
It's about moving away from blame and shame and toward compassion and support. But what about the people who are already in prison, The millions who got caught up in all of this?
Yeah, that's a huge issue. We need to prioritize sentencing reform, reduce those mandatory minimums, give people more chances for early release, and help them get back into society. That means giving them access to education and job training and mental health services so they can rebuild their lives.
Yeah.
You can't just lock people up for years and then expect them to just, magically fit back in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's about recognizing that they're human beings, that they have potential, that they deserve a chance to contribute. We need to break this cycle of incarceration and create a system that focuses on, rehabilitation and restoration.
Exactly. And it's not just about changing policies. It's about changing people's hearts and minds. We got to challenge those stereotypes and prejudices that fuel mass incarceration.
Mm.
And we had to listen to the people who have been most affected by all of this.
Yeah, it's about building empathy, fostering understanding, recognizing that we're all connected because ultimately the war on drugs hasn't just hurt individuals, it's hurt our whole society.
Mhm.
It's created the system that's full of inequality and distrust and division.
And if we want to undo that damage, we all have to work together. We have
Yeah.
to be willing to have these tough conversations, to push for change, to challenge the way things are, and to hold our leaders accountable.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that if there's injustice anywhere, it threatens justice everywhere. The war on drugs might be part of our past, but its effects are still being felt today. It's up to us to write a different ending, to create a future where justice and equity and compassion are the norm.
That's really well said, and I think that's a powerful note to end on. We've gone deep on this topic today, but really, this is just the start of the conversation. We hope this episode made you curious, maybe challenged some of your ideas, and most importantly, inspired you to learn more and get involved.
Because knowing something is only half the battle, right? We have to act on it.
Yeah.
Let's use what we've learned to make the world a better place. A place where everyone has a chance to thrive, no matter their race, their background, or any mistakes they've made in the past. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.